So here I am again, and I'm sorry that video got cut off. The phone rang, and when the phone rings, it just cuts the video off, and you have to start all over. So we'll just pick up where we left off, and we'll call this chapter 2, part 2. Okay. So anyway, I'm down in the creek. It's getting dark, and I'm scared, scared to be alone in the creek. So I kind of made my way back to the house and sheepishly looked in the picture window. The lights were on in the house and it was dark outside. And I'm looking in the picture window and I see my cousin sitting on the couch, quite alive. And so I knew that he wasn't dead. And I knew that I wasn't going to go to the electric chair. So I knocked on the door and they let me back in. And thank God I didn't get a butt whipping for that one. They realized it was an accident. So I got away with that one. But I got a few, believe me, I got a couple. So another cute story from those days. As I told you in chapter 1, I spent a lot of time in San Francisco every weekend. I would be down there with my grandparents and my friend Richard that I hung out with, that I got in a lot of trouble with. Well, we were out in the alley behind Richard's house one day, and this pigeon was there in the alleyway. And there's pigeons all over San Francisco, thousands of them, so it was no big deal. But this particular pigeon didn't seem afraid of us, and he walked right up to us and was walking around our feet. Really unusual behavior. And I remember I bent down and thinking I'd try to catch him. Well, I didn't have to catch him. He just let me pick him up. And I was holding him, and petting him, and he's he's doing this little thing. And we set him back down on the ground and tried to walk away, and he's following us down the alleyway. And I said, this is somebody's pet. This pigeon belongs to somebody. So I ended up taking him home in a paper bag, put him in a paper bag, and took him on the Greyhound bus Sunday night back up to Sonoma. And sure enough, he lived in the house there for a few days with us and walked around, followed us all over the house, jumped up on the back of the chair when you were having dinner, and always wanted to be near you. And so my mom said, oh, this is somebody's pigeon. So she puts an ad in the Chronicle, San Francisco paper. And some woman calls us, responded to the ad. Oh, I can't remember what his name was, Twinkie, or that's my Twinkie, or, whatever the pigeon's name was. I don't remember. But, she was so excited that somebody had found her pigeon. And she took the bus all the way up to Sonoma and came up and got her pigeon and was just thrilled and gave me a $5 reward, which was a lot of money in those days. And, she went back home with her pigeon. Well, the next weekend, she comes up with another little featherless pigeon that she had bought in Chinatown. This little squab, this little tiny thing, didn't hardly have any feathers, had a few pin feathers on him. And they eat them, in Chinatown. You can buy them in the Chinese groceries live, squabs like that, and then cook them. Well, she had gone down and gotten one for me, and she gave me a book on how to raise pigeons. And how sweet of her. So I had this little pigeon. So I started raising him. We'd feed him with an eyedropper. And, he grew up to be quite a pet, but a little crazy. I mean, I think that pigeon had some brain damage. I really do. Um, yeah, he was probably the first transvestite I ever met. Uh, Crazy thing. I'll tell you some stories about him. But we named him Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the president of Russia at the time. And Russia was, our enemy in the Cold War and always wanted to fight us and banging his shoe on the table. So we named him Khrushchev because he was a scrapper, he always wants to fight you. He'd get his little wing, pop, 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 pop. He'd hit you with his wings and peck you. So we called him Khrushchev, but he'd follow us everywhere. He was just crazy, There was a football out on the lawn, a little football, and that became his mate. And he would dance all around that football and blow himself up, and make his chest really big and try to mount that football. And that was his lady, I guess, was that football. Like I said, he was a little screwy. He really was. So he never learned to fly. He would walk everywhere. And our 3/4 of an acre had some pretty tall grass, and he'd follow us everywhere we'd go, leaping over the grass. Well, we had a horse. My sister had a horse, and it was about a city block away, and we'd go through the fields to get over to where the horse was and feed the horse every day. And that pigeon would follow us on foot, leaping over 1 foot, 2 foot grass, trying to get over and follow us to the horse. Would never fly. Now, if you picked him up and you threw him in the air as high as you could throw him, he'd open his wings and he'd glide down, but he would never take off on his own or fly. Never. And this other flock of pigeons used to come and land on the roof of our house, about 6 or 7 of them from the neighbor farm. They would come and land on the roof, and he would run back and forth on the ground, furious at their presence. But he would never fly up there. So we would pick him up and throw him up on the roof, and he'd run after those pigeons and attack them and beat them off with his wings and peck at them and chase them away. He didn't like his own kind. He liked his football. That was his friend and his mate there. So, like I said, he was the first transvestite I ever met. He started building a nest on the front porch. He started collecting twigs and making a nest. And it wasn't in a good spot, so we got a cardboard box, and we put his twigs in the cardboard box, and we set the box on this shelf over the washer and dryer in the garage. And we cut a little hole in the box so we could look in and see what he was doing in there as he was building his nest. Well, he would hop up there. He'd jump up on the washer and dryer. He could get up in this box and kept adding twigs, and he built himself a nice little nest in that box. And we gave him a small chicken egg to sit on. He's a male pigeon, believe me. He was not a female. He's a male pigeon. Like I said, he was a little screwy. But that hole that we could look in there, if he saw us looking in his box, he would charge out of that hole. He'd charge us. And the hole was so small he could get his head through, but not his body. And then he'd blow himself up, his air sac. He'd blow himself up and he couldn't get his head back in the box. And he was furious, little pinpoint eyes and boo-goo, boo-goo. And we'd have to squeeze his air sac so he could pull his head back into his box again. And, everywhere I went, that pigeon would be there. And I guess I was about 15 at that point. I had a Vespa scooter, a little Vespa. You could drive those at 15 and a half. And, I was starting to work on cars, on my dad's truck and stuff like that. And that pigeon would always be in my hair. He'd want to be in the engine compartment. If I'm working in there, he'd knock my tools off. He'd want to be on the fender. And so I had to get rid of him one day so I could work. So I put him on the ground and I put a cardboard box upside down on top of him. Well, he'd walk inside that box and the box would travel across the concrete floor with him inside of it. He'd walk on the concrete and drag that box with him, making this horrendous sound. Ooh, goo, goo, ooh, goo, goo. He makes this noise in that box. And I remember the insurance agent came over one day to look at the car. I can't remember why, but the insurance agent came. And here comes this box across the concrete toward him. This box is advancing toward him, going, ooh, goo, goo, ooh, goo, goo. And he's backing up. He goes, what in the world is that? Picked up the box, and it was the pigeon in there, of course. But we used to torment that pigeon, my cousin and I. We put him in the washing machine and turned it on spin. Dry washing machine. We turned it on spin, and we'd spin him around 150 times in the washing machine and set him out on the lawn, and he'd stagger around like a drunk man. And sometimes we'd put him in a 2-gallon bucket and grab the handle and swing the bucket like this with him in the bottom of the bucket, centrifugal force, and we'd turn him loose and watch him stagger around on the lawn. And he'd get madder than a hornet, he'd get those pinpoint eyes and blow himself up really big. And there was always that sand pile. My father always had a sand pile. He was always making concrete for something. And the sand was soaking wet under the surface of the pile. And we'd dig a hole in that wet sand. We'd dig a deep hole and we'd stick him in there tail first into the hole and pack all the sand around with nothing but his head sticking out. This little pigeon head, boogaroo, boogaroo, and he couldn't get out because his wings were compacted in the sand and he was stuck down in there. And we leave him in the sand pile for sometimes an hour or 2 hours at a time. And finally, my mother would catch us and, come after us and make us let him go. But that poor pigeon, I'll tell you, he was a nutcase. Sadly, I mean, I was the one that finally killed him. I did kill him, and it was my fault, and I repent. But I was coming home on my Vespa scooter, and I was pulling into the garage alongside my parents' car, and that pigeon flew down, or jumped down off the shelf where his box was, and landed on my shoulder and was pecking me and beating me about the ears. And I went to grab for him to get him off my head, and I lost control of the scooter, and it slid alongside my parents' car and scraped up the side of the car really bad. And I got so mad, I grabbed that pigeon and I threw him, and he hit the wall, and I killed him. He had internal injuries after that, and he died a short time later. And I did feel terrible about that, really, really terrible. That was a really sad event. But I was always a kid that had animals. I loved animals. I remember when I was about 12 to 14, I had 16 snakes in cages on the front porch of the house. My uncle, Mario, or Julio, my dad's older brother, would help me make these cages, really nice plywood cages with the sliding glass door. So I had 16 snakes, and I had a 2-foot alligator in the bathtub that we had bought down by Disneyland. They used to sell alligators down by Disneyland in the 60s. They had an alligator farm right next to Disneyland, and of course that thing grew. And it got to about 3 feet, and I can't remember what we ever did with it. I don't know. I can't remember what we did with it. I mean, in my mind, and my memory is very poor, that we took it to Steinhardt's Aquarium in San Francisco. My sister may know more about what happened to that alligator. But we had the alligator in the bathtub, and I had a red-tailed hawk in the garage that lived in the rafters of the garage, and we had chipmunks and squirrels and horned toads and just a white rat, and I mean every kind of animal you could think of. We had at our home there. This hawk, somebody had shot it, I guess, with a .22 or something, and the bullet had gone into its breast and carved a deep gouge and must have come out the other side because he had this big hole in his breast of raw flesh. And we picked him up in the driveway. He was in shock. He landed on our driveway after being shot. And not knowing what to do and being stupid kids, I went under my uncle's table saw and found a bunch of sawdust under there. And we packed that wound full of sawdust and went in the house and got a bottle of merthiolate. If you remember mercurochrome and merthiolate, that orange stuff for cuts, they don't sell it anymore. But I remember pouring mercurochrome in the wound that was packed with sawdust, and son of a gun, that thing never got infected, and that bird recovered, and he lived in the rafters of the garage, and we would feed him hamburger and scraps of meat when my mother would cook. And she hated that hawk. She hated him because when she'd go in the garage to do the wash, that's where the washer and dryer were, was in the garage, that thing would come down and land in her hair thinking it was going to get fed, and she terrified of that hawk. And she finally got to the point where she refused to do my laundry or wash my underwear until I got rid of the hawk. And believe me, my underwear were getting pretty rank, and I finally decided that I had to get rid of the hawk, so we did let him go, and he flew away. But yeah, always had animals, snakes, alligators, things like that. So we had a creek behind the house, Sonoma Creek. Not behind the house, but just across the Highway 12 there, just a short walk, quarter of a block. And we lived in that creek. I mean, my cousin and I and my sister, we lived in that creek. And, we built forts down there, and, up and down the creek, you could find the creekside dumps where they were dumping everything. That's how they used to do in that day. Everything went into the creek. couches, televisions, coffee tables, whatever anybody didn't want, they throw over the bank at the creek. And so we were able to get, pretty nice furniture and bring it back to our fort, and set up a nice fort with couches and coffee tables and old carpets. And we had a nice fort. Now here my memory starts to fail me. So my sister may recognize that I'm imagining or I'm off. I can't remember. But we made a fort in the center of this grove of trees. The trees hid the fort. It was in the middle. There was an open space in the middle, like living room size open space. And I remember dragging these couches and coffee tables and lamps that didn't work, obviously. We had no electricity down there, but I think we had a television that we had found that obviously didn't work. But we had set this living room up in these trees, kind of our fort, and had some brush that we put over the entrance so nobody would find our fort. Now here's where my memory can't remember, but I think we ended up stealing food from our parents' cupboards, one can at a time, to be inconspicuous. All three of us, my cousin, my sister, and I, and we were stocking our fort with food, cereals and different things, and thinking we were going to run away. And in our fantasy, we were going to run away and go live in our fort. And now here's where my memory is not good, but I remember faintly going down there and early in the morning or something, and some hobos that lived in the creek had found our fort. And I mean, it was a living room. It was set up with carpet, couch, coffee tables, everything. And they had found it with all this food. And they thought they had come home. I mean, a ready-made house down there, these old bearded old hobos. And I remember going in there, thinking we were going to go play in the fort, and we must have woke them up or something. They were sleeping on the couches or something. And I remember them yelling at us. And we scared them and they scared us. I think we scared them too, but we ran and never went back to that fort. Now, Georgina, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my memory from those days. And, our life in the creek was wonderful. It was a wonderful living creek. They had crawfish and turtles and snakes and bullfrogs, and it was a beautiful creek. And we'd catch crawfish and come home and eat them, and we'd catch turtles and keep them as pets. And, there was steelhead and all of that, trout. No longer. It's a dead creek now, just completely dead, not a living thing, not a pollywog in the creek anymore. It's pesticides and all that. But we lived in that creek, and we found so many Indian bowls and pestles and bowls, stone bowls, beautiful, 1,000-year-old bowls, I had, I guess, about 8 or 10 of them on the front porch, beautiful specimens. They should have been in a museum, And I treasured those bowls. My father hated them, and when I went in the service later in life, in my late teens and 20s, I was in the Navy for 4 years, and my father took all those beautiful Indian bowls and threw them in the Sonoma dump landfill. Can you imagine that? Got rid of them. They should have been at the mission in the museum. But yeah, it was I had a great childhood, just a wonderful childhood filled with nature. And, our kids today are just, all they know is their cell phones, but we had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. My sister had a horse, and she had bought him at the glue factory because he was cheap, I guess. And the glue factory had dyed him black because he was old. It was an old horse. He was supposed to be glue. And I don't know what she paid for him, $200 or something like that. And he looked just beautiful. She named him Blackie. But when she got him home and washed him and all the dye came out, she realized he was about 18 or 20 years old. I can't remember how old he was. But, he still had spirit. He still had some spirit, and he'd gallop. And, she joined a club called the Moonlight Riders, and was gracious enough to let me ride the horse once in a while. So I joined the Moonlight Riders too. And we kind of shared the horse, but it was her horse. And I was in love with this pretty little Aggie girl that had a horse. Her name was Sherry Berry. And I had her over one day, and I was going to show her what a rider I was and what a macho man. And I took her over to see Blackie, and I jumped on him bareback, and I gave him a kick, and he took off like a shot. And he ran about a quarter of a block and slammed on the brakes, and I went over his head, end over end, right in front of her. I mean, you talk about embarrassment on this girl I'm trying to impress, right? And I'm hurt too, man. I mean, it jammed my spine all the way up to my neck. I landed so hard. But I wasn't going to show any pain. I was going to make sure that she thought I was brave and macho. So I came back and I jumped on him again. Well, it turned out I had a big bunch of star thistles stuck in the seat of my Levi's. So when I jumped on him and those star thistles dug him in the back, he took out from under me, and I went over the other side of him, right in front of her, and landed flat on the ground. Well, that was the end of my impression on Sherry Berry. I don't think she ever talked to me again after that. So, I grew up in that farm community. Sonoma Valley was a farm community, and I joined the FFA, Future Farmers of America, and I took 4 years of agriculture. And in those days, to be in the FFA, your initiation, you had to castrate sheep with your teeth. And I'm not kidding. This is the truth. They would have sued the school today, I'm sure. But my ag teacher, Mr. Livingston, wanted us to learn the way the old shepherds did it before he would teach us how to use the burdizos and do it the new way. So, one of the kids would hold the sheep down by its legs on his back, and you'd take that little scrotum and you'd whack the tip of the scrotum off with the rusty pocket knife that he had and push it down. The little testicles would stick up, and you'd grab one and you'd stretch it on the cord, and you'd serrate the cord with the knife. And of course, when the cord broke, it went up and slapped you in the face like a piece of spaghetti, and you'd have to peel that off and spit that testicle out. And and all they'd give you is a stick of gum and never let you wash your mouth out. Just a stick of gum. That's all they would give us. They wouldn't let us wash our mouth out, from the blood. Well, this pretty little ag student, she was one of the cheerleaders, beautiful girl, real pretty girl, shapely, nice figure. She was watching us boys do it, and she didn't want to go down there twice, so she got two in one bite. And it went around the school, and nobody dated her for 3 months. What a terrible reputation that poor girl had, So these are just funny stories from my upbringing. So I got a steer, my dad did build me a corral and on our 3/4 of an acre, and I bought this calf and began to raise him for the fair, so I could have a steer for the fair. And his name was Calf Manna, and he loved grapes. He loved grapes, and that's how I'd get the harness on him. I would hold the harness up with a bunch of grapes, and he'd put his head in the harness to get the grapes, and I could buckle the harness. And I'd ride him around the corral, get on his back and ride him around the corral, and he was pretty tame. But these heel flies used to attack him. These heel flies. This is a problem. If you've ever seen cows out in the field running as a herd with their tails up in the air, it's usually because they're being attacked by these heel flies. And these heel flies bite them in the back of the heel and lay their eggs back there. And then the larva travels up through their body and exits through holes in their back. That's where the larva is. You can actually squeeze these things on their back and pop the larva out. It's actually a problem for the cowhides. It leaves holes in the cowhides, when they try to harvest the leather from cattle. Well, anyway, he was terrified of these heel flies. And 3 times he broke right through the corral and ran down the highway into downtown Sonoma and almost caused several car accidents running down the middle of the highway. And so my father made me get rid of him. I never did get to enter him in the fair. I was only a month or 2 away from the fair, and he was about 600 pounds by then. But my father made me sell him to a slaughterhouse. But I did have my steer, and I had a little chicken farm. I had 14 chickens in cages, automated with automated watering system. This was my FFA project. So, I was an ag student and loved animals. Yeah. So just one more funny story, right? I had buck teeth. terrible buck teeth. I mean, they stuck out there. And I was 16 and was beginning to drink a lot. My friend and we had our driver's licenses by then and had my old 49 Chevrolet, and we go to the drive-in movies and drink sloe gin. That was the only thing I could drink in those days that I could handle. I didn't like hard liquor, but sloe gin gets you pretty drunk. And we were at the drive-in movies, and this car in front of us had two guys and two girls, and they were making out passionately in the car during the drive-in movie. And the nylons were hanging out the window, and these guys were going at it with these girls. And I'm drunk enough, I want to check these girls out. So the two guys left and went to the snack bar to get some popcorn. And I kind of staggered over to the car and stuck my head in the window and, "Hey, baby, how you doing in there, girls?" And, I felt somebody tap me in the shoulder, and I turned around, and this great big football jock, one of the guys that had been dating these girls, had tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around. He punched me so hard, he broke my two teeth off at the gum line. Broke them completely off. Cold cocked me out in the parking lot. Now, in those days, I had black Levi's and a white t-shirt. That's what everybody wore. And of course, the white t-shirt was covered with blood from my mouth. And I think my nose was bleeding too. He hit me so hard. But my friend was so scared to get my body, thinking that they would attack him, that he let me lay out there through about half of the next movie. And he finally came and drugged me back to the car. And at that point, I don't know if I was out from the sloe gin or from the blow that he had punched me. But we got home about midnight, I guess, after the movies. And I had locked my keys in the house, or had forgotten my house keys or something, and had to ring the doorbell. And my mother got up out of bed and she opened the front door, and I go, "Look, Mom, no teeth." And I had blood everywhere. She passed out on the carpet, And so I had to have extensive dental work and had to have a bridge, which I have to this day, a bridge. And they paid for the bridge, but boy, I'll tell you, I had to pick apples every summer for about 3 years at 25 cents a box and pay every dime of that back. And, I sure got it for that. Got my teeth knocked out. But anyway, I had a little, before I got the permanent bridge, I had a little palate thing that fit up in my mouth with the two little teeth attached to it, a little thing. Well, it was January, or late December, and the Sonoma Creek was roaring, just a roaring creek. And my friend and I went down to the bridge to look at the flood, pouring rain. And I go, "Look at that." There was like a raccoon on a log that was coming down the creek. And I go, "Look at that." My friend George Dodge. But when I said, "Look at that," my teeth, my bridge came out of my mouth and fell in the water. I ran to the other side of the bridge and jumped in the water, and thrashing around with my hand caught that thing, and I saved my teeth. I don't know how my hand found it, but I saved it. Now, what's significant about that is we had met these two girls the night before, and we had invited them out for New Year's Eve. And the thought of going on this date without any teeth was a horrendous thought. So I was in a panic when I lost my teeth over the bridge. And I found them, thank God. Well, these two girls, one was a tall beanpole of a girl, flat-chested beanpole, 6 feet tall, no figure, and not all that attractive either. And the other one had blonde hair and blue eyes and was absolutely beautiful. She was adorable. Well, then we got in a fight, my friend and I, over who was going to get which one for our date. We ended up flipping a coin, and I won the pretty one. Then he didn't want to go. "I'm not going to go, that's not fair." And I said, "Yeah, it's fair. We flipped, you're going to take Linda and I'm going to take Sue. And, that's the way it is. And, you lost the flip." And so he finally consented to go. And so by this time I had, oh, that's another story. Oh, God. Let me back up just a little bit, and then I'll get back to the date with these two girls, right? So when I graduated from high school at 17, Instead of going to the high school graduation party, I had heard that there was a beach party in Guerneville. And I wanted to go to the beach party, not the high school party. Well, it turned out it wasn't the beach party, it was a bleach party. And it was held in an apartment out at Guerneville. And to get in the door, they had a big tub of hydrogen peroxide, and you had to dunk your head in the hydrogen peroxide to get into this party. And a lot of drinking and smoking and all that. About 20 kids in that apartment. So I did. I was drunk enough that I dunked my head in the peroxide. So naturally, my hair turned bright orange yellow. My brown hair turned bright orange yellow. And I got totally drunk. And on the way home from the party, I was coming around the turn in Forestville way too fast. And the road was a little slick. And I lost control. And the car spun around 3 times and slammed into a concrete wall and pretty much totaled the car. They had to call the highway patrol. And of course, my parents came and the cops had me there and they said, "Is this your son?" And they said, "No, that's not our son." And I said, "Yeah, it's me, Mom. It's me," because I had this bleach blonde hair. And they took me home. I got a butt whipping, but I had a 57 Chevy that I had totaled. And the thing was leaning on the frame like this, but it still ran. It still ran, And in those days, they weren't that particular, 62, something like that. The headlights worked, the taillights worked, and that's all the cops cared about, right? And the thing was a total. I mean, it was smashed up pretty bad. And the passenger door would not close because that's where I crashed it. So I had a piece of clothesline rope that I would tie the door shut to the window frame. That's how I kept the passenger door shut. Well, we had met these 2 girls, and we had this date in my old 57 Chevy that I had taken white shoe polish and wrote 69 on the side of the car, 69 on both sides of the car in white shoe polish, and this rectal Chevy with the fins on an angle there. It's amazing. The frame was bent. I don't know how we drove it. But so when we went to pick up Linda, the tall beanpole, she was beautiful. She had curled her hair and makeup and had this evening dress on. We're going to take them to the city and show them a big time in Ghirardelli Square. Big spenders we were, right? So then my friend perked up when he saw how pretty she looked, and that wasn't so bad. And so she got in the back seat with him, and they're already making out as I'm going down to Petaluma to pick up the pretty one, Sue. Well, it's pouring rain. It's New Year's, pouring rain. And Sue lived on a dairy ranch out in Katati by almost to Petaluma. And to get to her trailer that she lived in, her mother had passed away. She lived with her dad, and she had been raised as a tomboy in a dairy ranch, right? Didn't even own a dress. She lived in Levi's and T-shirts. Did not have a dress. And we're going to go to this nice restaurant, right? She's beautiful in face, had a beautiful face. So we're going down this dirt road to get to her trailer, and it's filled with big puddles and mud, So we get down to her trailer, and she comes out in Levi's and a T-shirt. And Linda, her girlfriend, said, "My God, we're going to go to the city. You can't go like that. We're going out to this nice restaurant in Ghirardelli Square." And, "Well, I don't have a dress." "Well, did your mother leave any clothes when she died in the closet?" "Well, I think so, but I never wore them." And well, anyway, Linda goes in and finds a dress that would kind of fit her, but it was too big for her, but it fit her. And it had a low-cut thing here, kind of low-cut. And it kind of hung open because the dress was too big. That story later. So we go to San Francisco. Now, my friend's in the back seat making out with Linda. Sue, the pretty one, she's sitting as far away from me as she can over against that door. And I was getting nothing. No kisses, no nothing, So we take them to this restaurant, high class. Walk in this place, in this high class restaurant. And this Chinese waiter goes to take her sweater off of her shoulders, As she's coming in the door, he reaches over to help take her sweater off to hang it up. And she goes, "What the hell you think you're doing?" And she grabs his sweater back, and I'm going, "Oh my God, this is not going to go well." So then we sit down at the table, and the Chinese waiter comes over and takes our menu items. And she wanted filet of sole filet of sole. So she said, I'll take the filet of sole. And he goes, we all our soul. We're all out of soul. And she said, what do you mean we're all assholes? What do you mean? Oh my God, I said, this woman, and then when the salads came, she's stabbing the salads with her fork and the tomatoes are flipping off the plate, and she's burping out loud at the table. And I'm going, oh my God, this is horrible. This girl is just horrible, Then she gets up and she goes to the bathroom and she doesn't come back for the longest time. And I sent Linda to go check on her. She comes out of the bathtub just sobbing and her mascara's running, down her face. And she said, it was all mirrors in there and I couldn't find the door. I mean, ugh. So now we're out on the street and it's New Year's Eve and people are throwing confetti and all this confetti is going down the low-cut dress that she's got. And she's got this mid-rib bulge full of confetti down here from everybody throwing confetti. And she's going down the street reaching down and throwing confetti at people, from her dress. And I mean, I was never so embarrassed in all my life. And this other girl was just a perfect lady. And my friend was just gloating over the fact that I was having such a miserable time. And I had spent like $100 on her, So we drive home back to Petaluma there. And my friend says, well, drop me and Linda off first and then go take her home. He wanted to see if he could sleep with her, with Linda. So anyway, I take Sue home. This is about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. Take her home down this long driveway with the potholes, to her trailer. Pouring rain, coming down. She's still over at the door, sitting way over there. I mean, I had not so much as held hands with her. And I spent all this money and I think, darn it, I'm going to get a kiss goodnight out of this deal. So I lunged over to give her a kiss, and the rope broke and the door opened and she fell out the door into the mud puddle, and I shoved that thing in reverse and peeled out of her driveway, backed all the way down the driveway and left her in the mud puddle, shaking her fist and screaming at me. That was the last I saw of her for 20 years. 20 years later, I was at a little nightclub down in Katati. And I'm coming out of the men's bathroom and she's coming down the hall. She had gained 40 pounds. I mean, she'd been married and divorced twice and had a couple of kids out of wedlock and looked horrible. I mean, there was no prettiness anymore. But I saw her and I recognized her, and I hope she didn't recognize me. And I tried to duck around her in the hall. She grabbed me. Oh, no, you don't. She grabbed me by the collar. And then we just had this laugh. I don't know. We just laughed and reminisced. And I guess everything was fine after that. So that's some of my Sonoma stories, There's more. There's more. We'll pick it up in chapter 3. Okay. God bless you.